Thank you for coming to this talk by Hélène Sicard-Cowan, right? Organized by the Department of French and Italian. Hélène has two MAs, one from the University of Nantes, and another MA and a PhD in French Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. She has published a book about the ethics of imitation in the literature and cinema of immigration in France, published in 2016. I'm not going to read the title because it's in French, and I have my limitations. It's very in Spanish though, I mean, it's not the case. So anyway, she has also published articles and book chapters on authors like Emile Zola, Flaubert, and topics like ethics, feminism, migration, etc. She's currently working on a manuscript on Emile Zola's naturalism, and I think that's probably related to the talk today, that is titled Rethinking Emile Zola's Relation to Experimental Medicine. So join me in welcoming Hélène to the panel.
Well, thank you for inviting me and for finding a time and a place for me to present my current research to you. Thank you for being here. I feel like I'm about to lose my voice, so I hope you'll bear with me because I'll have to sip. So today's talk is part of a larger interdisciplinary project which seeks to redefine Emile Zola's naturalist literature. So far, most scholars have taken Zola at his worst and his fictional work through the lens of his more theoretical writings, what the novelist claims to apply what will become the modern method of scientific inquiry, the so-called experimental method, in his documentary novels. Can everybody hear me fine? Yeah, I feel like I can't hear myself.
No.
Even though several scholars have identified unresolved contradictions between such claims and the actual contents of Zola's fiction, no one has entertained the idea, as far as I know, that Zola's appropriation of the experimental method could be a critical gesture, right, that reflects back the experimental sciences. This is precisely what I want to argue in my book. In other words, I will make the case for reading Zola's naturalism as a therapeutic and eco-centric literature at heart, which continues to have relevance today, as it addresses some of the ethical issues plaguing medical research, while suggesting potential ways in which humans can help themselves together with the rest of nature, hopefully thrive in the Anthropocene. As you will see, my project is still in a very early stage of development, which means that I've been spending my time trying to read primary sources. And I feel like it's much more of a collection of thoughts at this point, and I will be grateful for your input during the Q&A session to the talk. So here's the title. So, Le Vent, so I'm going to be talking about one novel in more detail is Le Ventre de Paris, The Belly of Paris. It's the third novel in Emile Zola's Roman cycle, and it is devoted to the newly erected Parisian Central Food Market, Les Halles.
May you interrupt, Hélène, please? May you interrupt? Roxana, we're hearing a lot of noise on your part. Could you please be on mute while she talks, and then we will bring you back? Thank you. Thanks. That's all. Thank you.
So Les Halles were erected by the architect Victor Ribata between 1854 and 1886. And it was meant to be the main point to provide food to the city, basically. So here you see it was considered a feat of modern architecture using glass and metal with very fine designs and everything. And this is a photo by Duano, and then the next picture is still Duano in the basement of Les Halles. This is the only picture of the basement I could find. It was a kind of a hidden place where animals were kept, especially birds and poultry, and then were slaughtered. and none of this exists anymore. I'd like to add also that this market has been in existence. The AI still exists. It's no longer a market of fresh produce. So this market was first built in the 12th century, and it also had a pillory, which meant that convicts were displayed, they were restrained, and people could, throw things at them, insult them. So I will summarize the plot of the novel briefly. So Florent Quenu, who is the protagonist, comes back to the French capital after spending years locked up in the penitentiary in French Guiana for a crime he didn't commit. He was convicted of murdering a woman during the riot that happened after the coup, the 1851 coup d'etat. Whereas in fact it was the government guard who killed the woman. His exaggerated masculine pride prompts him to reject the food offered to him by Madame François, who I believe is Zola's spokesperson in the novel. She's a farmer, suggestively named after Zola's own father, whose death Zola ascribed to the callousness of individuals who surrounded his father both in his professional and personal life. And Zola's father, I don't know if you know, he was a very famous architect from Italy, became French later on, and he is the one who built the aqueduct. So I don't know what you call it in English. Aqueduct, which still is still in use and provides the city of Aix-en-Provence with water. So as King Florent is characterized as suffering from chronic indigestion, so he comes back from jail and can't eat anything. His first encounter with Léal is a nightmarish one, where agonizing or already dead plants and animals are imagined by the protagonist to be an ocean trying to engulf him. Henri Mitterrand, in the notes he wrote for the novel in the 2002 edition, suggests that Zola's representation of Léal testifies to the writer's sense of culpability as a sinner prone to gluttony. Judging from the words used by Zola to qualify the effect which abundance of foods to be found in Léal have on Florent, I believe that another kind of motivation might also be at work here. This word is not coincidentally deluge. Deluge, flood, English flood. The threat of flooding and Noah's Ark are recurring tropes in Zola's entire Earth. And here, as in other novels by him, it conjures the image of divine retribution for inspiritedness. However, here the threat of an all-destructive flood remains just that, a threat, since in the novel, Zola imagines that change can happen in a non-violent way. In fact, I would suggest that Le Ventre de Paris, The Bellies of Paris, features 3 revolutions: a failed political revolution, a successful personal one, and yet a third future one, which appears to be based on men's acceptance of both their sensitivity and the guidance of certain female and non-human subjects to create multi-species societies based on mutual care rather than shaming and cruelty. So, as I will strive to demonstrate in this talk, in his novel, Zola sought to raise awareness about the hidden plight of other than human nature under the Second Empire, and to invite his readers to extend their compassion to all living beings. In what follows, I will thus focus on the topic of food consumption to bring to the fore this neglected ethical dimension of The Bellies of Paris, while showing that Zola's treatment of this motif embeds a compassionate critique of experimental sciences, more specifically experimental or modern medicine. In the course of the 19th century, there was a sign. So in the course of the 19th century, the stomach became an organ of prime importance next to the brain and the heart, if not the central and mediating organ as the site of generation. Redefined as the center of sympathies, the stomach appealed to the nascent French bourgeoisie, who considered itself to be the new central and mediating class in post-revolutionary France, and saw in the stomach the Republican liberal organ par excellence, in that it was perceived as an organ which served others generously while keeping only little for himself. Characterized in such a way, the human stomach conjures the organic ideal of a unified, productive, industrious, and self-administered society, as Bertrand Marquer remarks in De libre gastro-ventre, économie animale et économie du corps social. So here, we have Galvantois, caricature of the Greek Louis by Tomé. So, and you can see the image. I'm really sorry, the quality is, the resolution is not good, but he's actually sitting not on his throne, but on a toilet. Has this protruded belly, and he's ingesting all kinds of things. So really, he's no longer in the high spheres of power, philosophy, or whatever, but in the low sphere of feces, ingestion, digestion. And this is the little folk that are already crushed under financial issues, and he's still asking them to pay. With the rise of gastronomy in the 19th century, the mortal sin of gluttony was resignified as a desirable practice by French prominent figures such as the famous epicure and gastronome Brillat Savarin, and the influential early socialist thinker Charles Fourier, who believed that producers and consumers would unite in a democracy of consumption by their sensual sharing of the same quality foods. Brillat Savarin defined gourmandise, I quote, as, I quote, a passionate, reasoned, and habitual preference for whatever is agreeable to the taste. End of quote. Gourmandise was thus valorized as a potentially potent instrument for the creation of the social cohesion badly needed after the French Revolution. However, as Kristen Ross argues in Fast Cars, Split Bodies, the democracy of consumption associated with the notion of gourmandise was in fact the ultimate form of bourgeois democracy and the alibi of a class society. Indeed, in Le Ventre de Paris, in the belly of Paris, the food displayed in Les Halles is not for penniless individuals such as Florent and his friend Claude, who is an aspiring painter, as Claude remarks. And Florent is even said to bleed in the midst of a flood of dying or already dead sentient beings, as can be read in the text, right? Bleeding. Moreover, in the novel, the positive imaginary associated with the stomach as the physiological equivalent to the bourgeoisie and with gourmandise gives way to images of obstructed fluxes and ill health, such as indigestion, in order to call into question bourgeois self-understanding. Indeed, indigestion is widespread in the society Zola depicts in the belly of Paris, whether it consists in excessive, both active or passive, intake of foods, smells, or words, or the opposite inability to ingest any foodstuff, as is apparent in Florent's case. In Zola's novel, Florent's chronic indigestion is clearly associated with a feeling of moral disgust towards the society that has wronged him. There are several instances in the novel where the connection between the empire and Les Halles, the market of Les Halles, is established, the market being said to support the existing government under the Second Empire. This is why Florent, having set foot in metropolitan France and Lille, vows to turn down everything that French imperial society has to offer. Gradually, however, his will weakens under Lisa's influence. Lisa is Florent has a brother who owns a butcher shop, and Lisa is his wife. So Lisa doesn't trust her brother-in-law. She doesn't trust Florent because he refused his share of the inheritance left to her son by their mother, yet eats and dwells at her husband's expense. In addition, Lisa finds Florent morally disgusting for having survived 3 days without eating after he escaped from the penal colony. She also finds his inability to put on weight suspicious, even though his appetite comes back after the initial nausea and dizzy spells he experiences when presented with some of the rich, fatty foods exhibited in the butcher shop. To remedy a situation which he finds highly disquieting, Lisa thus manages to convince Florent to take a job as inspector of the fish shops located in Les Halles. There, Florent is miserable for several reasons, among which figures the loss of his health. Zola suggests that his protagonist is right to believe that the smells emanating from dead or half-dead plants and animals is jeopardizing his overall health. Didn't Florent inherit his job from Verlac, who had to resign because the smell of dead and decaying fish made him sick, potentially causing his death? And didn't the former butcher's wife die of chest illness because of the fatty smells of the dead chickens she sold? But why doesn't Florent quit his job? Since Madame François, the gentle, nice farmer, offers him to go live with her in the countryside, far away from Paris, which I quote, pourrissait tout, rotten everything, which, according to the good woman, a diagnosis which Florent agrees with. So Madame François has seen through Florent's soft heart, and she assumes that goodness can't develop in the French capital, but as well as I'll suggest later on, I'll tell you why he wants to stay in that job. So a little bit of suspense here. Les Halles offers a case in point for Madame François' appraisal of Paris. Indeed, Lisa and the two orphans, Marjolin and Cadine, who are practically born and grow up in Les Halles, both become monsters of cruelty. But Florent rejects Madame François' offer because he mistrusts women, like most of Zola's male protagonists who have had the Christian upbringing. Besides, if he quit his job, he would deprive himself of the egoistical pressure which consists in giving his wages to his dead predecessor's wife. Both Florent's attitude towards women and his egoism are elements he shares with another character in the novel, namely the struggling painter Claude Lantier, who is the protagonist in one of Zola's subsequent novels titled His Masterpiece. It is Claude Lantier who remarks that his friend Florent's obsession with revolutionary politics is all but altruistic. Compared to Claude, however, Florent will grow out of his self-centeredness to awaken to compassion, being caught by the police and sent back to the penitentiary after Lisa turns him in because he's planning a coup. Whereas Claude, painter, will persist in seeing only colors in Les Halles, thereby obliterating the suffering and agony which make the Parisian market an orgy of the eye for him. Henri Guillemin, in the preface he wrote for the novel, asks himself why Zola would have felt the need to include so many unappetizing descriptions of the foods exhibited in Les Halles. He suggests for an answer that Zola wanted to prove that he could craft a masterpiece with subjects deemed unworthy of artistic consideration. He believes that Zola took pleasure in proposing such descriptions, which some of Zola's contemporaries read as a colossal still life or gastric poem. In the space that remains, I would like to argue, however, that the images and metaphors deployed in these passages are, in fact, deployed by Zola to lay bare the gruesome reality surrounding food consumption under the Second Empire in France. And I found some of the preliminary, sorry, my voice is playing tricks on me. In the preliminary notes he wrote for the novel, which he took from another writer, Maxime Ducamp, Zola, the first things he writes, he says there are 6,000 cars coming every day to the market, 800 animals, horses and carrying stuff, which is the equivalent of, this is funny to me, 22,000 liters of space. And also it's just to show you the scale. So by kind of going behind the surface, Zola, I believe, gives the lie to the myth, which experimental scientists created for themselves. And sorry, this comes a bit too early because I'll make the connection between this culture of consumption and experimental sciences a little bit later on. But there was a myth among the experimental scientists that they sacrificed themselves, right, for the good of humanity. Some of them said, we're losing our health doing this. We're working in laboratories, that are in basements. It's humid and things like this. We're devoting our entire lives to this. But there were obviously, other real victims, if you want to say, in a much greater number, which were the animals experimented on. So, as we find out in the novel, food products in Les Halles were housed in 6 different sections, and Zola went to great pains to include copious descriptions of the different types of foods one could find in each of these sections. Under Zola's pen, carrots, tomatoes, and tongues are all described as baby. The agony of cut plants unfolds as we read. Unconscious sheep have their skulls cracked open. Fishes agonize for an entire day. Fish merchants break the legs of live lobsters. Ducks are plucked alive, some of which also have broken legs. Animals are kept in the dark underneath the eye. Eels whose feet have been amputated look like the lined-up horses of human babies. So this is all metaphors that he uses. Pigeons are force-fed, fruits are bruised. Some cheese looking like decapitated heads conjure the spectre of the guillotine, as well as scientific experiments routinely massively performed in Zola's era. Since the second half of the 19th century saw the institutionalization of vivisection as a modern method of scientific inquiry. It would appear that personification is the stylistic device most used by Zola to describe the suffering and fate of both plants and non-human animals in such an environment. In light of Zola's endorsement of French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's belief in an ontological continuum between all life forms, as evidenced in the Roman Expérimental, which I will turn to a little later in this paper, I believe that the anthropomorphism visible in the belly of Paris is best understood in the scientific sense. We're talking a little bit about this, the mirror neurons. Now some scientists, neurobiologists are saying, we all have mirror neurons, which make it so that we can actually feel others' feelings. And you'll be able to tell more than we have. So, yes, anthropomorphism should be understood in the scientific sense, whereby it denotes the natural ability for humans and very likely all living beings to recognize and mirror other states of mind and feelings. Contrary to Florent, Claude, so the aspiring painter, thrives in such an environment. He follows the orphans, Marjolaine and Cadine, wherever they go, marveling at their atrocious behavior. He sees the world in oppositional terms with the gras, the fat, waging and almost always winning, not almost, always winning, an endless war on the maigre, the skinny, right? The fat versus the skinny. Not coincidentally, in his justification of the calling of Parisian ruling dogs, Claude Bernard, who is the father of the experimental method and modern medicine, echoes Lantier's belief in the law of the strongest. I have the quote, I will be reading it in English, then I will read the French translation. In a big city like Paris, there is a multitude of animals which it is indispensable to slaughter in order to satisfy the requirements of public hygiene and even to make possible the continuation of social life. It has been calculated that if we were to stop these daily sacrifices of dogs for a single month, we would be overrun and soon almost devoured by these beings who would quickly multiply around us. Therefore, this is, so to speak, a real fight for life. End of quote. It was good for Bernard because he experimented mostly on dogs, so it was kind of like, he had an interest also in helping the city get better of dogs. So, as some of you may already know, Claude Bernard is considered the founder of modern medicine through his vulgarization of the so-called experimental method, which Zola claimed to apply in his own novels in the experimental novel. So the experimental method was highly controversial when it was first discussed and when it emerged, because it implied the use of live conscious animals in experiments designed to modernize French medicine by giving it a scientific basis. Even though vivisection was an old practice, but it was a very, it was a manner thing. It was part, it was actually linked to painting. Painters would, vivisection was used so that painters could have detailed portrayals and presentations. And I don't think it was very much used for medical purposes until the 19th century. So, among the first opponents to animal experimentation in the 19th century were medical doctors, who were against it for a number of reasons. But most were in agreement that it might stifle the ability to feel compassion in the students, if the medical students were exposed to it. In fact, as a historian of science and emotion, Rob Bodice argues in The Science of Sympathy, Morality, Evolution, and Victorian Civilization, Through their recourse to such a method, experimental scientists developed, I quote, an elitist and anthropocentric form of sympathy, as opposed to the more generous form of common compassion felt by the larger public, whom the scientists considered emotionally inferior, irrational, and ultimately responsible for social degeneration. Whereas they saw themselves, it was end of quote, this is my writing, whereas they saw themselves, the scientists saw themselves as, I quote again, living embodiments of the highest, if not the next stage of evolution. And he goes on to say, the scientist theorizing the morality of animal experimentation would invoke a spirit of sympathetic benevolence through practice. As I cut, I do good, the incantation. It was a form of learning to feel anew by practicing, based on an a priori abstract understanding of the moral worth of that practice. Ultimately, the scientist learned to redirect his feelings of sympathy away from the animal on the operating table, focusing it instead on the suffering of abstract, unknown human others. End of quote. In a way, okay, maybe so when it first happened that the experimental method became more and more practiced, people were practicing everywhere, in private houses, in flats, on the kitchen table at first, and then it was regulated, but not. Then laboratories were created, which meant that it was hidden, and scientists could do everything they wanted to. Nobody heard the cries and the screams, right? Because people were bothered. People said, we hear screams all the time. There are school children who are like traumatized. So it was practiced everywhere. And it was open to the public. Yeah, that's it. It was open to the public. Claude Bernard would have like amphitheaters, it would open it up and the public would come. So in a way, when they were public, the laboratory experiments were sacrificed on a massive scale because it was also, they sacrificed a lot of animals. Like for instance, veterinary school, before it was regulated, the same horse could be operated 64 times. Could be operated on 64 times before the animal passed time. And then after regulation, it was just 1 or 2 operations. So, okay. So in a way, these experiments were sacrificed on a massive scale, was justified with more or less sincerity as the surest way to better human health and happiness. In spite of the fact that in the end they didn't yield the expected benefits, but only pain. And it's very interesting because it's the scientist himself who said that. François Mageni, who is Bernard's predecessor and mentor, at the end of his career said, we have no cure, all we have is pain, the animal's pain. Which is also interesting because it means that these scientists, they knew that these animals are sentient. So they're not working with the Cartesian understanding of the animal, which I think in the 19th century things changed about the way we view the animal. So sorry, I keep digressing. So only pain, right? So these experiments that were open to the public, they can perhaps be interpreted as a chilling warning to those who might reject the evolutionary model put forth by the vivisectors for humankind, which is, place your consciousness in your reason, kind of cut yourself off from your sensitive side, If you don't do that, right, you look at the animals that scream in our experiments, they end up being killed, but because that's what happened. So if Marc Baudis uses the terms sympathy and compassion interchangeably in his study, this is what I feel that he does, Zola appears to pit both notions against one another. This is, for instance, apparent in a novel such as Dr. Pascal. So Dr. Pascal is a country doctor who's also a medical researcher, but he decided to, he was in Paris but moved back to the country. So according to the Goncourt brothers, two of Zola's contemporaries, The novel was intended by Zola as a comical novel based on Bernard's life, on Claude Bernard's life. And in it, a medical scientist and country doctor would witness his life's work being destroyed by his own mother and maid. Is it a coincidence that this doctor's niece and lover is named after the lover of positivist philosopher Auguste Comte, namely Clotilde de Vaux? I don't believe so. Especially since Auguste Comte was one of the voices who pleaded for the regulation of vivisection. And the term sympathy is used to characterize Dr. Pascal's attitude to his aging horse Bonhomme. Bonhomme is really out of compassion. You should really be killing that poor animal. He's like worn out, but he can't because I think sympathy. So Dr. Pascal is sympathetic, but this sympathy means that he can't really decenter himself, right? He would suffer too much to have his best friend killed, his horse companion. So here sympathy, I believe, for Zola involves an element of self-centeredness, which makes it unfit to provide the care required for helping patients regain their health. And in fact, as Pascal notices with surprise, when Clotilde visits his patients with him, the latter experience an immediate betterment of their condition. This is because she is able to feel compassion, and this is the term Zola uses, as Zola's narrator remarks. And this compassion is in turn tied to the love the doctor and his lover feel for each other. And this is precisely his love for her which enables Pascal to overcome his self-centeredness and become the incarnation of Zola's new man, a loving and compassionate individual, a far cry from the insensitive reasoning model sought by Claude Bernard. And Claude Bernard described his scientific ethos as such. Again, I will read it quote in English, in his seminal work called Introduction to the Study of Experimental Method, which was a manual for medical students. A physiologist is not a man of fashion, he is a man of science, absorbed by the scientific idea which he pursues. He no longer hears the cry of animals, he no longer sees the blood that flows, he sees only his ideas and perceives only organisms which conceal problems which he intends to solve. Similarly, no surgeon is stopped by the most moving cries and sobs because he sees only his idea and the purpose of his operation. Similarly, again, no anatomist feels himself in a horrible slaughterhouse under the influence of a scientific idea. He delightfully follows a nervous filament through stinking, livid flesh, which to any other man would be an object of disgust and horror. After what has gone before, we shall deem all discussion of vivisection futile and absurd. End of quote. However, not unlike Pascal, as I mentioned earlier, Bernard was not immune to feeling compassionate towards non-human animals, as attested by his decision no longer to use apes after experiencing how the only ape he ever experimented on grabbed and squeezed his hands when he was operating on it. And for Bernard, that was it. He could no longer use apes. So Bernard favored the use of dogs, cats, and frogs, and as time progressed and the anti-vivisection movement grew, it became animals such as rodents in the public generally considered pejoratively, who made up the bulk of animals used in labs. In The Belly of Paris, it would appear that it is Claude who embodies scientific sympathy, since the painter, since he mocks Florent when the latter expresses pity upon witnessing how Marjolin decapitates tens of pigeons in record time. Marjolin is the orphan. According to Claude, feeling for the fate of these animals is womanly and unsuited to an aspiring revolutionary leader. Not coincidentally, shaming men and women for expressing their sensitivity is one of the strategies extremist vivisectors such as Bernard deployed in order to silence their detractors. In the note, Florent internalizes Claude's discourse and the same night makes plans for a bloody paternalistic revolution, which would end up replicating imperial practices instead of creating a more equitable political order. There are other elements which support an interpretation of Claude Lantier as a foil for Bernard. The most compelling ones include the following. Lantier and Bernard, so Lantier is the painter, Claude Lantier is his full name. Lantier and Bernard share the same first name, Claude. Bernard turned to medicine after failing as an artist himself, more precisely as a playwright. And Lantier fails precisely as a painter in the novel, his masterpiece, which focuses on this character's tragic fate. Claude Bernard is known, in particular, for the Bernard-Horner syndrome, a condition which affects eyesight. And Lantier, the painter, is plagued with an eye lesion, as we find out also in the masterpiece. In The Belly of Paris, Lantier is depicted as paying daily visits to the butcher shop, tripe shop, and slaughterhouse in Milan. His creation of a new display out of rearranging meat cuts and various other foods, eroticized as female body parts in the butcher shop, conjures both Bernard's description of experimental science as, I quote, a ghastly kitchen. Oh, sorry, I don't have the French. What did he say in French? Une affreuse cuisine. With the, I quote Bernard again, delicious sensations, and quote, it triggers again, délice, right, in French, as can be read in his manual. In addition, his actual practice of tearing off the nerves and organs of the various animals he used in his experiments. Oh, sorry, fragment sentence. Where is the professor of French? Sorry, fragment sentence. Significantly, Zola's expression for Lantier's artistic style is cruel touch, cruauté de touche. Lantier's quest for pleasure in layout transpires in his confession that he can get an indigestion just by looking at the butcher's display window. And he calls the new shocking display he produces his true masterpiece. So as I said earlier, we have that connection. The kitchen table where you butcher the animals, the kitchen table, the same kitchen in which scientific experiments were first conducted. So we have like a metonymical connection there. Okay, we'll skip that. To come back, so I believe that. So what I'm trying to show here is that through characterization, Zola might be critiquing, scientists of his era. So we have Lantier, Claude Lantier the painter, and then we have, I believe, also Florent and Marjolin. Can be regarded as literary doubles for other prominent figures associated with experimental sciences, namely Gustave Florent and François Magendie, who was Bernard's predecessor and mentor, respectively. Gustave Florent, the son of one of the founders of experimental neurosciences, was a revolutionary politician who taught history at the Collège de France when he was only 25 and became a member of the Paris Commune in 1870. Like Florent, he spent time in jail. He was one of the organizers of the October 70 riots against the provisional government's moderate policy. In the novel, Zola describes the notes he jots down in preparation for his planned insurrection as both enfantine et scientifique, so childish and scientific, which kind of evoke, the professional career of Florent when he was a professor, but he was very young, 25. Now, if we now turn to Marjolin, which is the orphan, not only does his name sound a bit like Marjolin, but his lack of formal education mirrors Magendie's own, since his father was an admirer of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he was basically left to his own devices until he was 10. He didn't know how to read, right? So he was really on his own. I would add that Magendie was born under the old regime, where torture of both human and non-human animals was resorted to, sometimes as a form of legal punishment across species. So you could, you had a representative for like locusts, for instance, and they appeared, they were tried like humans. Not incidentally, in an era characterized by the medicalization of morality, Claude Bernard compared his activity as medical researcher to that of an investigative judge of nature, un juge d'instruction de la nature, which is a function found only in inquisitorial systems of law. To go back to Marjolin, Marjolin's compulsion to kill animals seems, moreover, to evoke Magendie's opposition to the regulation of vivisection. Magendie was really the most controversial figure with Bernard among all the vivisectors, because it was just really obsessive-compulsive. In light of this, it is tempting to read Zola's uncanny deployment of the term troué, which in English I'm not sure how to pierce, to make a hole, really the hole, troué, to characterize the statement Zola makes about the future, the statement he makes in connection to experimental sciences, in his preface to the second edition of Thérèse Raquin, his scandalous novel, which kind of propelled him onto the literary scene. So he says, the modern method, the universal tool of investigation, which the century uses so feverishly to make a hole, to tear, to pierce the future. Very uncanny, very pejorative. La méthode moderne, l'outil d'enquête universelle dont le siècle se sert avec tant de fièvre pour trouer l'avenir. This pejorative formulation in a text which has been widely read as Zola's promotion of Bernard's method can only be interpreted. Oh, I'm really sorry. See, I had problems with this, with saving, and there is a bit of blur. Just take 1 minute, so gosh. Let me see, because it's all. Okay. Right. So the fact that he uses this term, I think, is very loaded. Right? It's a loaded term, especially since Magendie was known to have discovered what was called the trou Magendie, so Magendie's hole, right? And the trou, it's really a recurrent metaphor in Zola's. I mean, if you read it, it's like the Seine River. There's also troué is associated with what the government did with the Seine, kind of like digging these canals and things like that. Okay. So, and he also uses in connection to this, this troué, so this modern method, pierces hole, makes holes, and he uses the word fever. And in fact, British commentators, British observers, really talked when they talked about Magendie's practices. They called this a mania, right? There was a mania. They called it, he epitomized the mad scientists, for the British. Okay, significantly, non-human animals are presented as playing a fundamental role in the evolution of mankind towards more compassion through their ethical behavior in the ventre de Paris, the bellies of Paris. I'm using mankind deliberately because it is really, it's self-evident when you read in the text that Zola is really making a critique more of men than of women. I mean, women are not spared, but most scientists were male. There were also female scientists who experimented. Agreed to do the experiments, but they were not really welcomed by people like Bernard. So Florent, indeed, owes his survival in Paris to Madame Françoise's horse, who makes a full stop inches away from his unconscious body on the road, in spite of being encouraged to step on the lying body by one of Madame Françoise's fellow farmers, who thinks that Florent is a drunkard who deserves to be killed mercilessly. It is also Florent's pet bird who delays Florent's return to the penal colony. He has a pet bird that's in a cage, and then at some point Lisa enters his bedroom, and there she sees the notes that he took to plan the insurrection. And the bird really tweets really loudly, and it's kind of like she has a sursaut de conscience, right? Because she's going to finally denounce him. But kind of the bird chirping makes her go away. Finally, Lisa's cat, suggestively called Mouton, sheep, evokes Zola's short story Le Sang, Blood, in which predatory relations between non-human animals are are figured as a byproduct of human violence turned against humankind in what reads as a retelling of the biblical story of Cain and Abel. This blows my mind away, this passage. Every time I read it. Man, like the bird, lived on the food providence gave him. He went about blessing God, picking fruit from the trees, drinking water of the spring. All God's creatures lived in the sun and formed but one people, having but one law, kindness. And then, sorry, I need to correct. Like two brothers or two brother-like characters are featured in this story, and one of them kills the other one out of fear that he leaves him. I mean, it's unclear, but so at the victim's cry, when he's struck, the strongest attacked the weakest, the strongest animal attacked the weakest. The world beat its tail and went on devouring itself forevermore. End of quote. So the cat mouton is interesting because he hears a story that Florent tells about because Florent tried to escape the penitentiary, and apparently one of his friends got left. They had to leave a friend behind, and when they found him again, he was being eaten alive by crabs. So crabs were in his tummy. So the cat mouton is there for the story because it's a little girl who says, "Tell the story of the man who was eaten alive." the daughter of the butcher's daughter. So here is what mouton does. Do I have it, or is it wrong in the context of? Yeah. So mouton after the story. Here's what Zola said, right? Mouton had remained sitting, his eyes fixed on Florent as though shocked by his story. Mouton, who still had the plate of sausages under his nose, because they are in the process of cutting the meat and turning them into sausages, all happened at the same time, had probably begun to feel disgusted by all this food and was scratching the table with his paws as though he wanted to bury the dish and its contents. In these examples, not only do the non-human animals represented exhibit the ability to show compassion towards others, but their compassion extends beyond their own species. And moreover, in portraying a cat's compassionate rejection of fresh meat, Zola seems to suggest that non-human, and by extension human animals, can learn to value and respect other forms of life. I will go quickly because, oh gosh, shall I stop here? Because it's going to be 15 minutes, right? So basically, I will try to go fast, and I will cut the quote, but I'll come to, I think, I will feel bad if
I think you have like 5 more minutes to conclude,
yeah.
and then we can ask, have questions, but you have like 5 minutes to conclude.
Okay, so the question which I would like to try to give a few avenues for answering, because this is really what I'm going to be based my argument on. If Zola was critical of experimental sciences, especially experimental medicine, why didn't he choose to express his opinion in a frontal manner, right? But rather resorted to oblique strategies such as characterization, which is what I'm going to argue. Well, first of all, when Zola's literary career took off, positivist and experimental sciences were imbued with an authority and a freedom which very few other domains of human activity could claim in 19th century France. According to Richard Turdiman, in Discourse Counter Discourse, the theory and practice of symbolic resistance in 19th century France, intellectuals in the 19th century in France were faced with the bourgeoisie's, I quote him, blustering intolerance, an inalienable attribute of power, which the writers didn't possess. As a result, according to Turdiman, the writers' oppositions, the intellectuals' oppositions, required more subtle modulations, it's his formulation. By 1840, the experimental method had been institutionalized. So the criticism, there was people criticizing, but it was more like in journals, like medical journals, etc. No, it was not widely criticized. And these sectors defended their abusive practices. They had devised a whole range of strategies, discursive strategies to ridicule their opponents. So they said the detractors lacked energetic virility. They were too obscurantist. They were anti-science, being anti-experimental scientists, the best was to be anti-science. They infiltrated the SPA, which is the SPCA, we call it the SPCA. All right, so I think under such circumstances, it is not surprising that Zola deployed characterization to convey his critique of contemporary scientists. And apparently, unfavorable portrayals of real scientists by writers in the 19th century who used voice for them were not a rare occurrence among detractors of experimental science, as the historian Percheron has shown in an article. And last but not least, I believe that Zola counted on the fact that by pretending to adopt the experimental method in his novels, he was trying to redirect the vitriolic criticism he received for what his detractors perceived to be his putrid literature, excreted from a sick mind, because he was really badly pathologized. That he redirected, it was a way to redirect that criticism towards positivists and experimental scientists, most specifically Bernard. I don't think Zola, because he could also guarantee that he wouldn't be censored. We could think that, if you claim that you are writing all this kind of very scandalous stuff, if you say, no, I'm just being a scientist and dissecting modern life, then you will not be censored. But as the century progresses, writers did get censored. And it was the case that a young naturalist author was censored, and although he had claimed that he was acting as a scientist. So I don't think that's that can be an argument. So anyhow, conclusion, or shall I stop this? So quickly, so Zola himself, in Mimesis, the representation of reality in literature, Auerbach describes Zola as in all fields, highlighting Zola's extensive scholarship, a breadth of knowledge gained precisely through experiential contact in real-life conditions. And this was a criticism that was made to experimental scientists, that they were creating imaginary beings because the conditions produced in labs can't reproduce real life conditions, right? Animals were stressed, there was a stress response that had an influence on the experiments conducted. So Zola went out in the field. He practiced a different kind of science, one could say, right? And he documented everything. He visited a mine before writing his European novel Germinal. He offered himself as a willing subject for an experiment on genius conducted by a physician in France. And finally, it would seem that he valued the role of intuition for the pursuit of truth more than did Bernard, even though Bernard did credit that faculty was playing a part in the scientific method. In the experimental novel, Zola argues that the naturalist writer's role is, I quote, when facing the unknown, to exercise his intuition, going ahead of science. Devant l'inconnu, exercer notre intuition et précéder la science. Thank you very much for your patience.
Okay, so for questions.
Well, first of all, just a broad question. Could you tell us a little bit how this particular presentation fits into your larger project that you're working on, and how you imagine the argument of that going?
Yes, thanks for the question. So I think in my mind, if I think of in terms of the book, we have 3 chapters, and that would feature in the last chapter. So the first chapter will be devoted to showing that Zola portrays scientists as painters and politicians. So that would be the critical part, right? Criticizing the method, but compassionate, because in all the novels where there is this, we can find this criticism, it's also, it's compassionate because there's the person, the character representing the experimental scientist is always friends with someone whom we can identify with. Right? In Love, it's in his masterpiece called Love in French, it's visible, it's very visible. Zola portrays himself as Sandoz, the aspiring writer, and Claude Lantier, the aspiring painter, and they are friends. So there is never an incommensurable difference between them, right? and I think this is important to stress. So that would be the first chapter. Second chapter will be kind of talking about, you know, this madness, this scientific madness. There is a whole context that created it. So what does Zola, kind of flesh this out? And in the third chapter, it would be more like the more happier chapter, where it would be focused on, you know, how is this ecocentric, how is this therapeutic, in which ways, you know, focusing on, you know, natural environment, the role of animals as, you know, guides and mentors, really, to create, you know, more ethical societies. And I wanted to say something else. Oh yeah, so my big job here, the job that I didn't perform here, I didn't perform any close readings, which, well, kind of with the troué, but I will need to figure out, because I want to argue that naturalist literature is also, I think that Zola really tried to rehabilitate it as an alternative to science, in terms of health and happiness, right? So I want to show that he developed strategies to try to extend compassion in his readers. So I was looking at the model, you know, like in the scenes where I talked about the cat mouton and the horse, there's a lot of participants involved, lots of different attitudes towards, you know, the situation that's presented. Oh, okay. Florent lying on the floor, about to get killed. Lots of different people kind of having different reactions. Same thing for the cat mouton. Way more people. And I was going to use, I don't know if you know Fritz Whitehout's work on empathy. He's a professor in German at Bloomington, I think. He's now made a reputation. He's been writing these books, bestsellers about empathy. But he developed this model called the three-person model empathy, because he figured out that in literature, apparently you have the dyadic model, where, you know, you take sides, you have two characters. He says, no, actually, there's always a third character. But I'm not sure it's going to fit, so that would be a big job for this part. Long answer, sorry. Yes?
I'm wondering if you would, specifically for that chapter, if you would consider including a critical framework that draws from animal studies.
Yes.
Okay.
As I was, yeah. So we talked about this morning as well. At the moment, I'm kind of like in this big mess where it's primary sources, because my original field is not the 19th century, and I know I have to catch up. So, you know, even going to read, you know, all these scientists' primary works, you know, introduction to the experimental method. So, yes, I will. I cannot tell you more because but yes, animal studies, yes, definitely, and health humanities, and there are people that do interesting work. Now the name is getting anthropologists as well. Very famous person. I'm blanking. The woman who does cyborgs and Donna Haraway. But there are more. There are other people now. I have this long list of books. I wish I had more brains. But thanks for the question, yeah.
I was struck, you had a sense of a preliminary in your work of the difference between sympathy and empathy, because they're not the same.
They're not the same.
I mean, really, empathy is being able to see yourself in the other. And that's one of the things I think I kept bringing to mind, how much the scientific method gets carried over into the pseudoscientific discourses that nourish the Nazi project and eugenics. And it's amazing that one of the things that it was people, there's a book published about 15 years ago about this, but it was a group of scientists at the T4 group in Berlin that were doing the experiments first on euthanasia patients, and they were actually transferred directly to create Auschwitz. And so that relationship between the scientific method and then what has to happen is you have to break down any kind of empathy with the object that you're annihilating. And it's interesting to see that discourse back in its origins in the 19th century, because so much of that scientific and pseudoscientific thought nourished the final solution as well. And what happened with the final solution, the reason they turned to gas is because they couldn't get the soldiers to do the killing because it was too hard on them psychically. And so they pumped them up with amphetamines and they gave them drugs. And then finally they said, we have to stop doing this. We're going to go to, they turned it into invisible. They turned it inside as opposed to the outside. So it's a very interesting sort of genesis of the work that you're doing here in its origins in the 19th century, and its sort of imprint on the literary tradition. I think it's fascinating.
It's fascinating. And Fritz Weishaupt, so he had a book, the first book was Cultures of Empathy, where it was kind of like this rosy notion of empathy is good. And the second book is called, I think, The Dark Side of Empathy, where it goes in precise, and he's German.
Yeah.
It goes precisely into this. I think I haven't read it, I've just read it. Still catching up.
But that's also Lacan's point, is that you can have an identification with the other, but it's always a split between. There will always, he says, even with altruists, there's a hostility towards the other that's buried in it. So maybe looking into that, but I think that issue is extremely important, not just for the 19th century, but for the way in which the 19th century establishes the practices that will carry forward to the mass murders of the 20th century as well.
Any other questions? I just wanted to.
Oh, I wanted to ask a question. Is it? I can't see anything, so can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So thank you for your talk. I was just wondering how you would compare the approach to science in Zola and Flaubert, because Flaubert, as we know, his father was a doctor. If you go to his house that he grew up in Rouen, there's all these medical manuals that he studied as a child. And of course, there's a lot of passages of Madame Bovary, such as her death, where he uses a very scientific medical language, and there are passages that definitely could be called naturalism. So I was wondering if you see a similar approach in Flaubert, or if there's a stark contrast between the two authors.
Thank you for your question. I haven't read Madame Bovary for a long time, but I remember that the doctor is mocked, right, Charles, with his hat. But there is there is a colleague of mine in France. I don't know if you know her work, Juliette Azoulay.
Mm-hmm.
No, you know. So she's working on this, precisely on this, and she in one of her articles, she argues that actually there is a scene in Bouvard and Pécuchet, but I need to review my Flaubert as well, which she actually dissects it, and she sees it as a criticism of vivisection. That's all I can say at this point. But so this
okay.
there is work being done on this, that go in this direction. That she sees that there is also that aspect of criticism. And actually, I mean, as I've been reading left and right, I believe that, and this is a bit tangential to a question, but Edgar Allan Poe's novella, short story, Double Murder in the Morgue, is an intertext for Thérèse Raquin. There are a few elements, and when I read Poe, he mentions the method, and I think there is work to be done too. I wouldn't be surprised if Poe was not criticizing the experimental method in that short story. And then you move on to Baudelaire, and you have a poem such as Le Soleil, which is one of the happiest poems in Fleur du Mal. And there he uses the metaphor of the rag picker, like the poet is a rag picker. He picks he finds stuff on the ground and then makes beautiful things of it. And that, I found out, that metaphor was used by François Magendie, who is one of the fathers also of the experimental method, the exact same metaphor, rag picker, the exact same word, chiffonier. And in that poem, the last couple of lines say, like the Soleil, I enter, hospitals, and I enter palaces, and I think this criticism of this section, I think is we're going to find out that it's more widespread than we thought in the 19th century. It is also Baudelaire who writes somewhere, I can't remember where, So imagination is the most scientific faculty, is the most scientific of all faculties, because only imagination has understands analogies. And
I think that's in the Salon, one of the
It's in the
Salon, maybe
Salon.
the 1846.
okay.
Yeah, because he also talks about photography, and he feels that photography can supplant imagination. So it's, yeah, the Salon of 1846.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry, long answer. That didn't really bring anything new, but thank you.
Oh, it's okay.
Remember that it was Baudelaire who translated
Who?
Edgar Allan Poe, exactly.
Yeah.
And that the Dupin character in the Baudelaire, is in the Poe, is someone who defies the method of analyzing things and dissecting
Exactly.
it in detail in favor of the intuition of knowing that
Exactly.
one letter is
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is what,
I have a comment that may turn into a question or maybe something to think about for you, because you've been talking about vivisection. And honestly, I don't know the history of how vivisection was regulated, was outlawed in Italy, but what I know is what happens in Italian literature mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century, and how a recurrent theme is the connection between the figure of the anatomist, so the theme of anatomy, dissecting a dead body.
yeah.
The artist, the figure of the artist, and art in the sense of aestheticism. So sacrificing the living in the name of an abstract ideal of beauty, and it's usually a female loved one who dies, but it's sublimated in a painting or some work of art, and therefore transformed into the immortal perfect beauty that could not possibly exist in a living creature.
Yes.
So the painter and the doctor who loves to dissect beautiful dead women, and necrophilia.
Totally. Yeah.
Necrophilia, so the love for a dead body, sometimes literalized, so at least left hanging. Was there something actually consummated? Like is
Yeah.
raising?
Into female dead body?
Yes, of course. Somebody who has been obsessed with this woman that he cannot possibly have. And then there is a final scene in which she composes this beautiful melody. And they found her body mysteriously dead, covered with flowers. And this is a Katie novel. A story, long story. But so necrophilia, anatomy, and art. All linked together.
Yeah.
So even beyond vivisection, then
Yeah.
anatomy becomes a metaphor for a certain type of art and a certain type of love. So necrophilia as in a way the opposite of empathy,
Yeah.
if you want.
Well, in Thérèse Raquin, Zola, there is a whole passage about la morgue, right? Where you put dead bodies, because Laurent kills his lover's husband to be able to marry her. And then he's so stressed out because he needs to be sure that the police doesn't find that body. That body was, he strangled the person, the body sunk in the river. So he goes to the morgue, back and forth, back and forth. And Zola writes that La Morgue is the first lover of a lot of people who come. This is the only place where young people come and see new bodies, deformed body. And so this features there. And then if you read this masterpiece, what you describe as, the painter wanted this abstract beauty, this is exactly what happens to Claude Lantier. He wants to paint this woman. Can't do it, right? He has a wife who is called Christine, a Christ-like figure. And at the end, he destroys the painting. He kind of cuts her throat, he defaces her, and he ends up committing suicide because he can only paint this kind of ideal thing that doesn't,
So necrophilia is a metaphor for a certain approach to life,
to life. Yeah.
whether in art or science
Yeah.
and interpersonal relationships. That's what I worked
Thank you.
on for the 19th, my 19th century spree was, I became obsessed with this connection.
Oh, you worked on this extensively.
I've written a couple of papers, but my period is 20th, 21st, but I've become really interested in this theme, necrophilia, connected with a certain approach to art.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to read your work, so I will look at it.
And a student of mine translated one of the short stories in questions on novella, so I can share it with you.
I think David has a question.
I do. I don't know if I can formulate this question. I just have a bunch of sort of impressions in my head, but it has to do with the conception or the role of animals in Zola's critique of science. And it sounded to me as though, on the one hand, the animal world, before this kind of fall that you described, the animal world was one of harmony and peace, and they did not echo human behavior, and humans didn't do what, or see what animals do as justification for doing what they do. So there's this sort of like, I don't know, is it a target or sort of a utopia that's out there that so I'm wondering where he's going with his critique of science, and is there something that relates to understanding the other, or understanding something through understanding how the body works? So the vivisection is taking place in order to understand something, but it seems like Zola is saying you never get there. You never, understanding how bodies work doesn't mean that you really understand them. You're killing them. You're missing what was there from the very beginning, which was sort of a compassion and empathy and understanding, a different kind of knowledge. So that scientific knowledge will always fall short of something? Is that part of the critique?
I think that's what, yes, I think that's what is
And like knowing is kind of like killing. I mean, in a way, like knowing is the dead letter. It's knowing and living are not the same thing. And that passion is what it's about, or something.
Or that maybe
I'm confused by my own thoughts here, but
No,
I'm
but
trying to figure out.
That I think it's a dense question. I think so. If this historian of science, Jean-Yves is right, because he says, usually opponents to vivisection were actually opponents. They were opposing science. It was theosophists. And he says, the taking the animal side in literature comes much later on. But Zola does this at the beginning. At the beginning, he plants even, right? A short story like Simplice. It's a beautiful plant, soul plant. I don't know what to call it. Who gets killed by a botanist, and Bernard was also started as a botanist as well, but maybe scientist did probably. So there's that aspect, and then there is Zola's article published in Le Figaro called L'amour des bêtes, in which he actually says his dog, for him, when he died, it was like a tearing of his own flesh. So there is something about that. I need to think about that more, because it's this belief, this kind of, he has this abstract belief in the ontological continuum of life, but as you say, it's also very visceral, very carnal. So that's fascinating, yeah.
Yeah, another thing I was wondering about is where anesthesia sort of falls into this one, when anesthesia is developed for surgery and that sort of thing, and is the discourse really about alleviating the suffering of the person, or the living being that's been cut, or does it have something to do with separating the person who is doing the surgery from the suffering that they would otherwise be witnessing?
So from what I know, anesthesia, they needed animals to have pain, because the reaction to pain was an indication for them. So anesthesia was kind of like practiced, I think, before they had the instruments to constrain the animals, and Bernard will be one person who will build those. It was not to minimize pain, no, not for the animals, because they needed the screams, they needed that.
It's really interesting. If you remember in Germinal, there's this scene when they take the horse down and the horse dies before the workers do, and somehow he gets much more pathos out of the moment when the horse dies than the workers. So it's a very interesting way of trying to call for identification for the suffering of the workers, but displaced onto the horse. So it's a very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're out of time, so we need to stop here, but let's thank Hélène again for her talk.
Thank you. Such a short notice, much appreciated.
Yes, yes,
Really.
it was short notice.
I have a little thing because like when I put this on my PowerPoint, a caption generated automatically. It said cow lying on top of dry grass. And I'm like, wow, Zola would have loved this. Merging of himself and his favorite animal to turn into a bear.
Yeah, that's great.
That's not any better myself.
Yeah, that's
Thank you,
great.
Hélène.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.